These are the inquiries that I'm making to myself right now. Why are you going on podcasts? Mm-hmm. What do you want? One thing I've always known about myself is that I was motivated by some sort of culturally born appetite for fame, celebrity, success, power, all of the trinkets that anyone would recognize that still dominate what is now known as the manosphere in many places, male status symbols, affability, ability to attract mates, status, all those things. And yet I also had, and I feel it still, what feels like the spiritual equivalent of a pathology towards mission. Yeah. Something that you are going to do this no matter what. If this kills you, you will carry on doing it.
I laid out at the start to the audience, look, we cannot talk about the trial or anything material to that trial. And I do fundamentally believe that people are innocent till proven guilty and they should be allowed to go through due process. He has, as you say, had some very serious charges made against him. He has emphatically denied any wrongdoing. And we will see, as I said in the interview, what transpires in the trial. I do think the fact he took this Bible into the courtroom, he clearly is going to fall back on his latent Christianity. He only converted several years ago. I would imagine we're going to see this reappear as a plank of his defense, which is he's a very different character now. So we'll see. So I think for all sorts of reasons, it was perfectly valid to interview him. Also, he'd done a few interviews in America, which were, I would say, not particularly challenging Russell Brand on this. And I felt like over the 2 hours that we did with him, that it was a very revealing insight into his character.
Hello everybody, welcome to episode 66 of Life and Life Only, and this is Piers Morgan, Russell Brand and the media. This is, I suppose, slightly following on from a series I did 2 episodes called Axel Rudiger Barner and the media, and it was a way of commenting on media without doing a whole show on it, because I think if I said everything I wanted to say about media, both mainstream and alternative, I mean, that would be multiple episodes. You never know, it might happen in the future, but I thought, because this encounter, if you want to call it that, I don't know if it was an interview, discussion, debate between these two very well-known figures in England and I guess in America as well now. They did about 1 hour 50 together, and it was very compelling, I must say. So I did want to do something on this, make a bit of a comeback for Life and Life Only this year. There'll be a few extra things at the end of this show as well. A couple of other things I wanted to talk about. So yes, the Piers Morgan versus Russell Brand encounter, it streamed on the 24th of April. I watched it, I think, the next day, and I've just had a second watch for this podcast. Like I said, it was compelling, and it reminded me a little bit of the Dave Smith, Douglas Murray talk they did on the Joe Rogan Experience. That was, I think, just under a year ago. And again, there were so many interesting things going on, both in terms of the information that was given and all the subtext, everything else around it, and also the reaction as well. So with the Dave Smith, Douglas Murray one, their discussion wasn't all about Israel and Palestine, but that was probably the most interesting part of it, I guess. Douglas Murray has been embedded with the IDF, and Dave Smith is a critic of what Israel's doing in Palestine. So predictably, when their talk went online, a day or two later, there were all kinds of videos, some saying that Dave Smith had destroyed Douglas Murray, some saying the opposite. Obviously, the pro-Israel channels were championing Douglas Murray, as was Sam Harris. He described it as an intervention. But I think with that one, probably 80 to 90% of the reactions in terms of the videos were saying that Dave Smith had won the debate. Obviously, a debate technically it's not there to be won and lost. It's about the truth coming out. Anyway, the reason I'm saying that is that since the Piers Morgan Russell Brand interview came out, virtually everyone has, to use an American expression, dunked on Russell Brand. And they've mostly focused on one particular moment. Now, if you've seen it, you'll know, of course, which moment I'm referring to, but I'll comment on it when we get there. But it's interesting that the mainstream and alternative media both seem to have leapt on that, making you wonder how much difference there is between them. I still think there is a difference, but I was surprised watching this again, how Piers Morgan seemed to get a free pass. I mean, perhaps it's just because you know what you're getting with him. He didn't really do anything against type. Or maybe it's because, I don't know, the Young Turks or whoever want to be invited back on his show. You know, no one denies that this is all a game, but they'd probably just say that within the media game, some of them are trying to get the truth out, and they'll say that other people aren't and that they're grifters. We'll get to all that. Of course, Russell Brand is in that space, and certainly in the past would have probably aligned with the Young Turks politically. But Anna Kasparian and Cenk Uygur, who I will mention in a minute as well, they've both been on the Piers show quite a few times. Before I start an analysis of this talk, and there is going to be a lot here because it was fascinating, and part of it was fascinating for what was perhaps not being said as well, what was being implied by Russell Brand, really. I feel like this, my video is certainly going to be a bit more even-handed, because I think I'm almost defending Russell, really, and this is not to do with the criminal allegations. We'll deal with that as well, but in terms of the reaction, I think maybe people were perhaps waiting for an opportunity to get on Russell Brand's case and ridicule him and so forth. But I think there were kernels of truth coming out in this talk, and I think they were all coming from Russell Brand, basically. Like I said, Piers didn't really do or say anything that you wouldn't expect, didn't really have any new insights. It was, of course, an interview ostensibly to promote a book, but it doesn't have to just be that. So he doesn't really talk about the content of the book. He obviously talks about Christianity. So about the two protagonists, Russell Brand has worn many different hats. He's been through many identities. But I find him sort of weirdly convincing in all of them. Now, the question being, is it an act? And this is the theme of this analysis. At times he's been a drug-addicted, wacky, sex-crazed presenter. And we'll talk about the Channel 4 Dispatches documentary as well later on. What I remember was that he was allowed to say things. For example, I think it was the GQ Awards. He came on stage and I think Hugo Boss must have been up for an award or something.
Also glad to grace the stage where Boris Johnson has just made light of the use of chemical weapons in Syria, meaning that GQ can now stand for Genocide Quips. I mention that only to make this next comment a bit lighter, because if any of you that know a little bit about history and fashion will know that Hugo Boss made the uniforms for the Nazis. And the Nazis did have flaws, but, you know, they did look fucking fantastic. Let's face it.
The way he delivers it, it's not delivered like a truth bomb. It's delivered just as, God, isn't that weird? You know, and I think everyone laughs along. Maybe some people fact check that later on and find that, yeah, maybe that's true. And then he was a sort of left-wing politico, and, you know, he was on Newsnight and all these kind of very serious programs, Question Time, calling for revolution, was compared to John Lennon, was called a sort of poor man's John Lennon by some people. Mentioning that because, of course, I do have a podcast, if you're new to this one, called Glass Onion on John Lennon. Then he pivoted to being what you might call a wellness guru. He was doing meditation and yoga videos. And then now I suppose you'd call him a truth/conspiracy guy. Because I always call it truth/conspiracy, because sometimes it's truth, sometimes it's just conspiracy, and sometimes it's both. The truth, of course, is very difficult to ascertain. But now, of course, he's a Christian. He's still doing his YouTube channel, but his persona now is very focused on being just a family man with 3 kids and a Christian. I take issue with people who would just say, oh, he's a talentless hack. I mean, his films, I've only seen bits of 2 of his Hollywood films. They look pretty terrible. And he even more or less admits that later on in the talk with Piers. But there's no doubt he's charismatic. He's got something. I mean, I used to compare him with David Blaine, who, funnily enough, has also had sexual assault allegations, but they seem to have been dropped. But they both had that thing where they were obviously quite intellectual. They'd obviously read books. They had a bit of mystery about them, although you can't really see that with Russell Brand now. He seems to be so demonstrative that there's not that much mystery. The only mystery really now is how much of it is him just being a grifter, how much is a performance, and how much is true. We do get some insight into Russell Brand's use of long words later on. Piers is basically continually trying to come out with these zingers, these gotchas, even while claiming he isn't doing that. And he does kind of get him on this long words thing, but we'll get to that later. I see through a lot of Russell Brand's alt media videos and his whole shtick because I'm well seasoned in that. You know, I've been watching those kind of documentaries and listening to podcasts about that since podcasts have been around, I think. But since 2007, I've been very well versed in that truth/conspiracy scene. So I can see where he's using all the buzzwords and things. And I'm just going to give you a selection. This is from his YouTube channel. These are the titles. RFK just exposed something insane. It's too late, with a picture of Bill Gates. No one was supposed to notice. It's stupidly obvious now. Everyone is getting exposed. New documents expose something sinister. Those are recent ones. And then in between all those, you get the Sunday service, which is Russell and his wife. Obviously, that's got a religious flavour to it. But I think these clickbaity titles, actually, they're not as bad as they used to be. I think a couple of years ago, it was more clickbaity. And I remember having discussion with someone. I had a discussion group here in Tunbridge, where I live. And it was around the time when I had started to see through Russell Brand. I don't think it's all an act myself. I'm going to see what thoughts and feelings come to me as I'm reading through my notes. But this lady I was talking to was saying, I love him, he's brilliant and everything. And I said, well, yes, I understand the fuzzy feeling of someone who seems intelligent telling you what's wrong with the world and telling you what's going on. I know that feeling, but is he offering solutions? Does it make you feel better about the world? You know, if he tells you exactly what's in our food, and I've studied that myself years ago, and it was absolutely horrifying. Not just the horrendous treatment of animals, but all the chemicals and additives that are put into our food. Okay, fine. So he tells you that you're being poisoned, essentially. Now, most people don't have that much choice about what food to buy, like, in other words, to go gluten-free or organic, or to really try and buy eggs that are truly free-range. Even the phrase free-range, by the way, is untrue. I won't go into it now, but they only have to have a certain amount of freedom for eggs to be legally stamped as free-range. And he talks about awakening wonders, and he's got millions of subscribers. He does a lot of Jesus body language, and obviously looks a bit like Jesus. Encourages subscribers, but I've never seen him reply to a single comment. Never. So, does he care? Again, it's a question. I don't have the answer, but I've got some ideas. Now, if you thought I was ripping into Russell there, let me rip into Piers Morgan a bit. At heart, he'll say he's a journalist. I'd say he's a tabloid journalist. He's former editor of the Daily Mirror, which is, a mild improvement on the Sun, I suppose. Russell Brand actually sums him up during the talk better than I can, which we'll get to that. I thought Piers was still being investigated regarding phone tapping, and there's a video of him saying on camera he had no idea of phone tapping at the Daily Mirror, even though he's the editor. I mean, I wouldn't trust him myself, and I mean, he's in love with the establishment, loves the royals, famously got ghosted by Meghan Markle and then turned on Harry and Meghan. Not that there wasn't stuff to turn on them for. Having said all that, I think he has had some kind of breakthrough regarding alternative media. So he's now got this Piers Morgan Uncensored show, and he gets all kinds of alt media people on it. And I think things that he would have dismissed as conspiracy theories a few years ago, he now takes seriously, and he realises that a lot of the stuff he used to dismiss is either true or very likely to be true. And I suppose he inadvertently reflects the public's similar shift. He did actually admit as well in a fairly recent interview, maybe it was last year or something, that he did trust authority too much in the past. So he's having a bit of an awakening, but having said that, he completely accepted Virginia Giuffre's suicide, the verdict of suicide. Didn't question that at all. So he'll only go too far. He accepts that 30,000 Iranian citizens were killed by the regime in apparently peaceful protests. I mean, that at least part of that has been fully debunked, really. I'm sure some nasty stuff went on, but he'll trot out these lines, you see. He's a tabloid guy. He knows that repetition of the same thing cements it in some people's minds. And he gets called out by Russell Brand on that. One of the things, shortly after October the 7th, when he was still pretty much an Israel supporter, again, he's got the line about Israel has the right to defend itself. That's a line that someone came up with that is just repeated and repeated and repeated. And he's a line that he said himself he became famous for. When he had pro-Palestine people on, he would say, "Do you condemn Hamas?" And he's just looking for a yes or no answer. And Abby Martin, just give you an example, she's been on there a couple of times, I think. And the first time she was on there, she was having a debate with what she would call an Israeli propagandist. But the lady she was debating with, of course, called Abby Martin, "Well, aren't you a Putin apologist? Because you were on RT." Anyway, towards the end, Piers said, "So, Abby, do you condemn Hamas?" And what he does is, when it's clear the person is not going to, he'll just press them because he knows it's a kind of entertainment. And he knows also full well that in reality, it doesn't make any difference to the world whether Abby Martin says, "Yes, I condemn Hamas. No, I don't condemn Hamas." In view of the hour that's gone before, where she's been made her position perfectly clear. So he's looking for these zingers. He's looking for headlines. Now, interestingly, I've seen him on other shows. He does go on other people's shows. Mehdi Hassan's show, for example. It's always quite entertaining when they get together. Is it Russell or someone else talks about him as a Jerry Springer figure? And Piers is immediately, his face lights up and he says, "Oh yeah, I know Jerry Springer. He's a really interesting guy. You know, I admire him a lot." I think it was with Candace Owens. She sort of lightly confronted him and then didn't really follow up on it. He loves Rupert Murdoch, and that's mentioned as well with Russell Brand. And Piers sees himself as a ringmaster, in his own words, of debates. But just as he says to Russell Brand, "Oh, you know, a lot of people think that you're a grifter, that you've found a way of using Christianity to cover yourself with these sexual allegations," Piers Morgan has found a way of framing fiery debates of people screaming at each other as, quote unquote, listening to both sides. So he's grifting as well, there's no doubt. Let me fess up. After criticising him here and talking about this Russell Brand interview, I'm still going to be watching his show because it is interesting. There is enough in there to make it watchable. But I would just say, you know, proceed with caution with Piers Morgan. I mean, the way he brings out people like Ben Ferguson, who's basically a Trump mouthpiece, is going to defend Trump whatever happens. Cenk Uygur, who I mentioned earlier, of the Young Turks, who apparently hates Alex Jones, but it's just completely turning into Alex Jones. And Piers clearly has him on, hoping that he's going to explode and it's going to be good TV. And then there's a guy called Professor Morandi, who is, I guess, an Iranian regime mouthpiece. And every time Piers has him on, the ad hominems start. He knows what he's going to get, and he doesn't stop. He doesn't stop himself, or whoever books a guest, you know, he obviously okays it. You know, he knows what he's doing. This is the point. There's a slightly comedic thing. He's a bit of a cartoon. He's almost like a cartoon truther these days. He's cartoony in the way of Alan Partridge. Even the fact that people make fun of Piers because every time he has an interview, he says, "Hang on." And in fact, Alan Partridge does that as well. Now, I don't know if Steve Coogan and the guys who wrote Partridge originally took a bit from Piers. I don't think Piers was really a name in the early 90s, was he? I'm not sure. Anyway, there's Richard Madeley used to do that as well, of Richard and Doody fame. Hang on. But they're not really confronting people fully. And the title of this video, this Russell Brand video, was Massive Grifter, which tells you a lot. That's a phrase that Piers comes up with halfway through. And the highlights at the beginning are mostly about him confronting Brand, and then this famous bit with Russell Brand looking for a Bible passage and the clock ticking. But, you know, I'd be lying if I said that I wasn't drawn in by that massive grifter thing. I thought, oh, great, he's going to confront him. So I have to be honest and say that I'm willing to sort of play Piers' game, if you like. I'm willing to listen to these talks. Anyway, those are the two protagonists. So as I came to this talk 2 or so weeks ago, so they obviously look very different. Their images couldn't be more different. They've both come out of the media cesspit. I don't think that's the word that was used, but Russell Brand points out the similarities, and they both survived. They both went to America when arguably they'd run out of options in England. I came away the first time watching this thinking that they'd basically exposed each other for what they are, which is a combination of bit of truth-seeking and then a strong element of grifterism. That's not a word, but anyway, I like the word grifter. Playing a similar media game, which is now an alternative media game, because they're both in the alternative media, don't forget that. That might be a bit of a broad term, but they're both apparently some alternative to mainstream media. Another similarity, of course, is that they'll both go on mainstream media shows still. Now, I wrote a few notes in my diary after I watched this. Try not to repeat stuff I've already said, but I've got here. Piers predictably went for the clickbait title and didn't seem to be really listening to the bits of truth that Brand came up with amid all the admittedly eloquent waffle. Now, when I say waffle, I'm not saying that it's not true what he's saying, but the idea of waffle is just word salads. That's another word for it. Someone described Brand as word salads with a dressing of bullshit. I'm not sure if Brand's conversion to Christianity is indeed a cover to help his upcoming trial on sex allegations, but it's telling that he's been ridiculed for a moment of silence. Dead air. That's the Bible passage, the famous moment. I put here, mustn't interrupt the flow, Russ. I didn't actually believe the allegations a couple of years ago, but the number of people who claim to know something is growing, and his performance, in inverted commas, gets very tiresome after a while. And I mentioned that he almost intimates to Piers that he's guilty or that he's expecting to go to jail. He's doing Sunday sermons with his wife now and still doing videos with clickbait titles. I already mentioned that. This Piers Morgan Russell Brand interview is technically there to promote Russell's new book, How to Be a Christian in 7 Days. Obviously, he wants to talk about other things, and they don't really go into the content of the book. So it's not a conventional, I'm here to sell a book talk. So near the beginning, Piers talks about their history and the current allegations. He says, I don't know where the truth lies. Russell Brand talks about the eye of the storm and about truth and uncertainty. And Russell does this a few times, as Piers does to him. They kind of describe what each other is like with quite a lot of accuracy, and that's one of the fascinating things about this. So Russell Brand talks about Piers and his cockroach power. They've both moved through the media. Russell describes it as the dreadful world of media and surviving. He says something that I agree with, that Piers has got tenacity, at the very least. Russell Brand does sometimes try and take over the show, and he talks with that rhythm that he's got, that verbal diarrhea rhythm that tends to take over. He touches Piers on the shoulder a lot, which is kind of a control thing. Don't want to go big on the body language stuff because I'm not an expert on it. They talk about Rupert Murdoch, and as I said, Piers is a big fan, very grateful for how Murdoch's helped his career. But Russell Brand drops in that Murdoch influences elections and wars and that media is not neutral. He talks about the funding of Associated Press, which is a press outlet that a lot of newspapers would get their information from. And he also talks about, quote, stories that would blow some of the world's biggest stars out of the water forever. So he's intimating that people like Piers Morgan and people in the know, in the celebrity world, they know that there probably are stories that are being kept on ice. But is that a good thing? You know, if they know that a celebrity is a sexual predator and they keep it on ice, people might be attacked in the time that they're stalling, waiting for the right moment to unleash the story. You know, it's pretty terrible. In terms of how Russell sees himself, I think he kind of reduces himself down to, you know, I'm a bloke from Essex, I'm a West Ham supporter, I'm a father of 3, I'm the only child of a single mother, he says. I'm surprised that Piers doesn't ask him how he squares it with God that he may go to prison unjustly. I'm not saying that's a question I'd ask, but that feels like a question that Piers might ask. Russell Brand says we're going to find out the truth. This is about his trial, which is coming at the end of the year. And don't be afraid of that truth. I don't remember everything he said, but I've got in my notes he's sort of equating the truth of the world with the truth of his sexual exploits. And yeah, I don't know, I wasn't too impressed with that. He now seems to have pivoted and says sex should only be within marriage. So, really? That might be easy for him to say now he's married. I don't know what his sexual appetite is like nowadays. They do agree on a few things, and they agree on fame being an insidious drug and it warps values. Now, regarding this long words thing, Piers does bring up that Russell had told him that he used to basically read dictionaries and presumably thesauruses as well to try and find words. And Russell puts in the word perspicacious, having used to describe Rupert Murdoch, Mephistophelian. Is that right? Later on, he uses the word specificity rather than specifics. I caught that one. And again, that is calculating. There's no doubt. There's a very comical bit, actually, when Russell uses a word that I don't think Piers actually knew, and I didn't know, and I'm an English teacher. And Piers immediately denies it, denies that he's that thing, that word that he didn't understand. Russell Brand points out, regarding this thing, that when he was 30, he had a relationship with a 16-year-old. He was also 30, I think, when he first did an interview with Piers. I think that was GQ. I think he was 31 or something. He does make the point that he was more like a 19-year-old when he was 30. There was arrested development, such as you get with rock stars as well. He talks about sudden opportunities and his assumed importance and how he found it difficult to talk to women, and now there's all these incredible opportunities. Piers describes him variously as honest, but also brazen. I mean, honest about his sexual exploits. I'm sure he was boasting about it, no doubt, but that is an important point, that he was enabled. People encouraged it, people laughed at it, the outrageous stuff he'd say. Piers continues to press Russell on his former lifestyle. He mentions, what's a moot point, that dating a 16-year-old would be a crime in certain US states, including New York. But, what's that got to do with anything if he's not in America? So I don't really know why he brought that up. They mentioned the Dispatches documentary. This was from Channel 4 in 2023. Soon after it came out, Piers said on his show, it's great journalism. But, if you look at the editing of that documentary, it's just a total hit piece. They may have some truth in it, but for Piers Morgan to not even point out how it's been edited. One podcast I listened to described it as feminist propaganda. It's this thing where there's a belief in feminism and that women have agency, but then in these cases, because he's a predator, somehow women weren't able to say no, and they talk about, on the documentary, not necessarily in this talk, they talk about it basically had sort of groupies, and they'd go for quickies after Big Brother or whichever show it was. But these women chose to do that. They were using him while he was using them. Okay, if you're a 16-year-old girl dating a 30-year-old guy, maybe he has got the upper hand, maybe he's got power over you, but they don't really talk about what kind of 16-year-old girl. There are 16-year-old girls who are sexually avaricious, is me using long words, you impressed? And precocious, and maybe she's zeroed in on him. It's the lack of context. The fact that she's 16, that obviously tells you something, but there are different types of 16-year-old girls. Anyway, one thing that's a pattern through this talk is that Russell Brand will drop in things that he really wants to talk about, and he'll drop in little comments, almost like truth bombs, which seem to have been missed by everybody. Everybody is just focusing on this one moment, which I will cover later on, this dead air moment. So he talks about the lack of need for integrity in the media compared to legal investigators. He talks about Piers' way of directing conversations, which will then create beliefs in people, which is true. He points out that this title of Shagger of the Year, which he got 3 years in a row apparently, was encouraging his behaviour. Now, it's not encouraging criminality, obviously, and Piers asks him, where's the line? And Russell Brand says the line is consent. Russell Brand also points out that when all the Me Too stuff came out, no one came up with anything then, so he's questioning the timing. As I said earlier, timing in the media is very, very questionable. Russell then pivots to COVID, but still talking about media. That's his big thing, which I think is much more interesting. When the trial comes for the allegations, that will be dealt with, hopefully fairly, although considering I'm following Lucy Letby in that case closely, my trust in that is going down and down. It was a bit of a pivot to talking about COVID suddenly. Piers keeps trying to draw him back to his questions, which often are trying to set Russell Brand up. He describes the mainstream media as akin to evil, existing to maximise people's vulnerability and the ability of powerful interests to manipulate. Like I said, Piers doesn't want to really talk about that. There are other truth bombs, and clearly Russell Brand knows how the world works as well as you can know. It's just, as with Piers, how do they use the knowledge that they've got? Piers does question that the sexual allegations were related to Brand's activism, and he uses this journalistic technique of saying, a lot of people think that it's bullshit, or some people think that you're lying. Russell politely calls that reductive, quotes George Carlin about no need for a conspiracy. I don't know how familiar with Bill Hicks or George Carlin Piers Morgan would be. He's obviously heard of them, I guess. Piers does agree that the pandemic reporting was leading, but that's necessary in a global pandemic. Russell confronts Piers about shaming people into getting the vaccine, accepting the claim that you can't transmit the virus if you're vaccinated. Piers admits that he was incredibly censorious and wasn't doing his journalistic duty, once again, coming back to that again, to be more sceptical. He's a bit sceptical sometimes, but he has limits. Russell points out, well, maybe Piers will have another mea culpa in the future as more information comes out. I don't know if he's talking about the vaccines. He talks about the vaccine as a concoction because it doesn't necessarily fulfill all the criteria for what a vaccine is. Some people have called it an injection, an arm spear, whatever you want to call it. Piers cuts him off and asks Russell, which vaccines do you accept? That's my impression of Russell doing an impression of Piers. It's, which vaccines do you accept then? Again, what's that really got to do with anything? What's Russell's opinion on the measles vaccine got to do with anything? I suppose it's interesting because people want to know, are you just anti-vax across the board? Now, Russell, after quoting George Carlin, he quotes the Andrew Marr and Chomsky interview, which quite a few people have quoted in podcasts and so forth in alternative media. It is a fascinating little bit of an interview. I'll put it in the show notes. Essentially, Chomsky says to Andrew Marr, you might not think you're self-censoring, but in fact, if you didn't have certain views, you wouldn't be in the position you're in. I don't know if he says this, but he intimates there's thousands of other people that would like to be in Andrew Marr's shoes. And there's an implicit understanding that you have to play the game. Russell kind of reiterates that he and Piers know the media game, while Piers isn't really listening and just presses him on vaccines. Points out higher truths are more important. He says a prayer for Piers that he can essentially break out of his conditioning. He starts to mention an interesting thing that Alex Jones and David Icke may have been proved right on certain things. Now, I don't know about Jones, but with David Icke, he was calling out paedophile rings 20 years ago, there's no doubt. It doesn't really get to finish this point. He tries to detonate a few more truth bombs, which are ignored or missed. Then I think they come back to this later on. He makes a mistake of talking about Alex Jones predicting 9/11, which was a mistake. There is an Alex Jones video from a few months before 9/11 where he's kind of saying something in a roundabout way, but it's actually William Cooper, the author of Behold a Pale Horse, who, I'll put this in the show notes, I think it was June 2001, he says, in the next few months there'll be an attack and it'll be blamed on Osama bin Laden. The mistake that Russell makes here, maybe Piers has just taken it that Russell's talking about, Alex Jones knew that Al-Qaeda were going to attack the US, and says, well, why didn't they tell the president? Piers is totally bought into the official story of 9/11 to the point that he probably wouldn't even be aware of any conspiracy theories beyond the 3 or 4 that everyone knows about. And he's not going to spend any time looking into that. And he knows for his brand, excuse the pun, talking about Piers here, not Russell, that you can only go so far. But the point that Russell's making is that some things that were regarded as wacky or completely wacko are now accepted. Now, I've made this point on this show, in fact. Don't remember which episode, but there are certain things which are now accepted by the mainstream that would have been called paranoid or conspiratorial. For example, that governments are massive arms dealers and that social media is stealing your data. But the problem is that the public are misled, and Russell would say by people like Piers Morgan, into saying, well, okay, I accept that now, but any other stuff you then tell me, I'm still going to dismiss as a conspiracy theory. Russell says, quote, conspiracy theories are difficult to corroborate due to real power's ability and necessity to mask itself. That's not a COVID mask, by the way. He talks about the Punch and Judy show of Trump and Starmer, and he actually calls Piers' show, in a polite way, a circus. Quite a few times during this talk, he is saying stuff that everybody's thinking. That Piers' show is ridiculous and that, okay, it's entertaining and there will be bits of truth that come out. But it is a circus with him as a ringmaster. Russell tries to get back to media messaging while Piers just wants to ask him more questions about vaccines, basically get control back. He asked what Russell Brand would have done as Prime Minister. Now, there was quite a funny thing. It was a parody done by Charlie Brooker, probably on Newswipe. This was his show. And it's actually a woman pretending to be Russell Brand, as if he was Prime Minister. It's sort of like, we've got to get rid of money, mate. Yeah, got to get rid of the corporations and all that.
The latest recount confirms no votes have been cast in this year's general election, leaving Russell Brand the default winner.
Where is this called? Let me spread harmony. This is Harmony and her mate Faith and Hope. Hi. I'm going to take him for a Cobra meeting if you catch me insinuation. Hare Krishna. Promise we can give her the NHS.
Brand immediately appoints his cabinet. Kate Moss becomes Chancellor. Noel Fielding is Foreign Secretary, while the Minister for Culture is a photograph of Noam Chomsky stuck to the end of a broom.
Britain's former MPs are settling into their new careers.
What?
Ed Miliband is now a delivery boy, while George Osborne works in a garden centre.
But Brand's unconventional shake-up is only just beginning.
Prime Minister Brand today closed the London Stock Exchange and abolished money.
We're no longer mentally caged by these capitalist sick notes, these illusory IOUs, these paper shits.
Well, obviously, the abolition of money changed the face of the city. Banks shut down, buildings stood completely abandoned, and without financial workers keeping the concrete dry by walking back and forth from their desks to sandwich shops and so on, the city quickly began to return to its natural state. Within a week, there was ivy completely covering the exterior of the Gherkin, gazelles grazing on the former floor of the Stock Exchange. It was really all quite serene if you ignored the massive food riots taking place the length and breadth of the country.
There seems to be no end to this rioting, and of course there's nothing in the shops, which is making the looters particularly angry.
As Britain burns, Prime Minister Brand is otherwise engaged doing a press junket for Get Him to the Greek too.
An odyssey, if you will.
No, Britain's on fire.
What's that, mate?
His promotional obligations complete, Brand heroically insists on watching footage of the rioters.
Oh, that is beautiful.
Inspired by their energy, he decides to join in. The rioting continues unabated for another 72 days. 89% of the country is in ruins. Desperate officials arrange for a state visit from Vladimir Putin, who is offering the UK a bailout deal in exchange for leaving NATO and establishing a Soviet missile base.
I'm going to go in there and appeal to him on a human level, see what his face does.
Prime Minister! Prime Minister! Prime Minister!
What, mate?
Disaster strikes 5 minutes into the negotiations when Brand has sex with Putin's 23-year-old granddaughter in a corner of the room. Within hours, Putin flies home and orders an all-out nuclear attack on Great Britain. As missiles race towards a defenceless UK, Prime Minister Brand delivers a final address to the nation.
Obviously, this nuclear attack ain't ideal.
And I'm sorry that your kids are going to burn to death in your arms and all that. But on the other hand, reality is just a construct. So don't think of it as losing your existence, but gaining the ultimate freedom. Sayonara, peace out.
As the first warhead detonates over central London, the initial blast is drowned out by a collective sigh of relief from the population below. And then Brand's Britain is destroyed.
That is a valid point for Piers to ask him, what would you do, like in a practical way? So essentially what's happening in this talk, which makes it so fascinating, is that Russell's going off into flights of fancy and trying to look at, he would say, deeper or more expansive themes, which is mostly about media, whereas Piers is looking for one-line zingers and, you know, he's got the title Massive Grifter. He's probably really pleased with that. And what I would like is somewhere in the middle. Now, we always like something in the middle, don't we? We're never happy. But Russell does basically avoid this question. What would he do? But then he says, well, I'm not the Prime Minister, you know, I'm not a politician. I don't need to be able to give you great solutions. Personally, it would have been nice if he'd had a couple of solutions. He did say, listen to experts. He said valid experts, and Piers says, well, which experts are valid? And that is a valid point. Russell does drop in the dying on the streets in narrative that was supposedly what's happening in China. And of course, the big thing about COVID, don't know if I've mentioned this on the show, but maybe it's about 2 years ago now, there was a news story. Oh, the CIA have investigated COVID and they found that it's probably a lab leak. And that was kind of at the bottom of the BBC website. Piers, I don't know what he said specifically, but I've got here, Piers tries to trap him again. And Russell kind of denies that the virus exists, which again is not a good move. He said that the vaccine has killed more people. Piers talks of anti-vax, and then he says, do you believe in any vaccines? Russell, again pretty politely, calls him out about how Piers is aware of outcomes and how things look. Russell wants to focus on the possibility of decentralisation and freedom and the possibilities of new media. And he sort of says, really, that what's the point of pointless speculation on Russell Brand's vaccine knowledge? Because then Piers tries to trap him again, says, oh, you've got young children, you know, are you vaccinating them? Expecting, I suppose, to get, if the truthful answer is no, you know, that'll get a few headlines as well. Russell describes him as sniffing for headlines, which is exactly what he's doing. Abby Martin, just to mention her again, she actually did a Chomsky versus Ma thing on Piers years ago. There's a short clip, I think, of her on the show, but it wasn't really developed, but she said to him, oh, you know, you might think you've got freedom to say what you want. And Piers said, oh, no one's telling me what to say. But the whole crux, as I've already mentioned, about this talk between Piers and Russell is how calculating are they? How much of it is a show? I'm trying to steer you back, you see. I'm trying to control your minds and the conversation, the one-way conversation we're having here. So Russell's trying to steer him back. He's trying to steer Piers back to the weightier topics. Piers is trying to get Russell back to the point. He calls him out on this thing about long words. We have mentioned that already. Russell talks more about media and how Piers doesn't confront real power, which I'd say is true. He talks about Piers' potential and talent and what he could be doing, and puts him right that anti-vax is actually just general scepticism because we're not being told the truth anymore. A few more truth bombs, and there's a nice bit where Russell looks at Piers' notes and says, oh, isn't it supposed to be uncensored or whatever? And Piers does promise him that everything will go out as it happened, which as far as I know is true. But then, of course, you've got that highlights bit at the beginning, which is leading the audience before you get to the main interview. Piers then describes Russell as a chameleon, and Russell points out the hypocrisy of Piers saying that there's a cringy bit about government water and Russell wants a bottle of water, and he's sort of saying, here, mate, gives a bottle of water, then trying to say that he's not ordering a bottle of water, but he's been in the game long enough to know that people will give him a bottle of water if he wants one. I felt like he was just trying a bit too hard to say, well, I'm not a prima donna celebrity. Anyway, So as well as media, Russell's constantly bringing it back to being a Christian as well. His overriding belief is in Jesus Christ, and that's more important than what they're talking about. And in the grand scheme, if you're a Christian, obviously that is true. Piers tries to catch him out again. This is the thing that I wish more commentators had pointed out. Like I say, he got free pass, really. He references him not liking Fox News in 2014. That was when Russell was doing the Trews series, TREWS. I think those are probably still online. But now Russell will go on Fox. I don't know how many times he's been on there. It's this idea that now he's gone from left wing to right wing, even though these terms don't mean much. And trying to catch him out from 2014, I mean, that's 12 years ago. Can't a person evolve in that time? Hilariously, later on, Piers uses the word evolution for his views changing. It's so hypocritical. Russell goes off again, doesn't really answer the question, makes a good point about, as I said, left and right being meaningless. And then, not listening at all, Piers just says, climate change? Trying to catch him out again, because apparently, when Russell he was a kind of a lefty, that term does exist. It does mean something. I'm saying it doesn't mean much. And then he started to deny climate change. And, this is the essence, I'm afraid, of Piers Morgan. It's being controversial within the Overton window, challenging people to some extent, but then knowing full well how to play the game. Piers does concede that, he likes some of Russell's stuff and some of it's true, but mentions the word grifter again, says a lot of people say he changes his opinion on a dime. Russell points out that people say that about Piers, which they do. The Israel thing, he changed that over a few months. Okay, a lot of people had that same journey when it became obvious what Israel was doing. When Russell calls Piers out about him also changing his mind, Piers says, yes, but it's my show. And that's quite telling, because it's like, yeah, you can say that about me, but it's my show. I've got control. He gives quite a good description of Russell Brand that apparently some people say there's eloquence but no real views. And I think Piers might find that if he looked in the mirror. Piers smiles at that point. He's enjoying the sport, the spectacle of this. Russell describes Piers as argumentative and obstreperous, which I looked in the dictionary means noisy and difficult to control. Piers immediately said, no, I'm not. I'm not argumentative. I bet my bottom dollar that Piers doesn't know what obstreperous means. But he wouldn't be able to admit that. I've admitted it, and I'm an English teacher. Piers then talks about Christianity as possible cover. This is what I mentioned when I was reading my diary entries earlier. Russell had been publicly baptised by Bear Grylls, who's a mutual friend and is the unsung hero of this conversation, apparently. They both talk about what a great guy he is. I've only seen a photo of Russell being baptised, and it sort of equates to, I don't know if it's still the front cover, if you like, of his YouTube channel. I think he might have changed it. But for a while, it's this thing where someone has their finger pressed against their face, looking deep in thought. And this baptism thing, I mean, it looked pretty cringy, but okay, fine. I didn't see the video. Probably not going to watch the video. But anyway, he had a public baptism. So he obviously wants people to know that he's now a Christian. Piers describes him as hypersensitive about being challenged. Russell frames sensitivity as intelligence and awareness, but also frustration that the conversation could be better if Piers didn't go back to his gotcha instincts. Those are my words, that last bit, not Russell's. And skill at generating conflict. I can kind of see Russell Brand's frustration, because this could be a different talk. Piers is bringing it back to just trying to trap him all the time. So I can see frustration there. Russell talks quite eloquently of an idealistic world. Well, Piers once again mentions, he just out of nowhere mentions, oh, is that the Bible that you took into court? And then Russell again makes a good point that the reason he's as sensitive is that he can predict where the thread is going, the gotcha thread, if you like. When Piers asks him a question, he kind of knows where it's going and he wants to stop it in its tracks. Russell actually describes Piers' show as a hideous spectacle. Again, it's done politely. There's only a couple of bits where he looks a bit angry, but he even turns that into comedy. I think Piers is just hard to trust, as I said, because of his tabloid instincts. And I don't think he's going to change, He's changed, like I said, I think he's seen the alt media in a different light now. So he is evolving, but I don't think that instinct will ever change. Right, then we get to this famous Bible bit. So basically, they talk about, as I said, the Bible that he took into court. And Russell was looking for a passage from Isaiah. And I think I timed it. It's about a minute of what's known in the trade, in the radio world at least, of dead air. Of course, on TV, you can fill dead air with visuals, which they don't do here. But honestly, when I first watched this a couple of weeks ago, I actually found it, I'm trying to think of a good word, not charming, but actually I admired Piers for letting the dead air go on. Because this is new media. It doesn't have to have the old rules. You don't have to fill in all the spaces all the time. Russell kind of goes into a strange state. He's muttering to himself. He does seem to change. Now, again, coming back to the crux of this whole thing, sorry to keep mentioning it, everybody, is that an act? Or did we suddenly see a thing where Russell not necessarily forgot he was on camera, but had a moment of sincerity there? I watched another video where someone was pointing out that there's lots of page markings, and there clearly were on the Bible. You can see that. He's marked lots of pages and passages. Someone said, was that a performance? Did he just get one of his lackeys to mark the pages? I don't think that's true. And it is a bit sad that the alt media have just zeroed in on that moment, like I said, along with the mainstream. Another thing about Russell Brand, rather like maybe John Lennon and other people, they kind of work as a loud person, but when they're quiet, they do almost like pull it off as it seeming genuine. And obviously John Lennon was into meditation. Russell Brand at various times, I think, has been into it. He identified as a Buddhist before. Piers obviously tries to get him on that as well. Oh, you used to be a Buddhist. You're an atheist. Then you're a Buddhist. Anyway, Russell eventually quotes from Isaiah 12, I believe it is. And the passage finishes with, "The Lord himself is my defence." I'll be honest, when I was first watching this, I was expecting Piers to jump in and say, well, the Lord can't help you in court, is he? You're going to bring the Lord as a witness? But of course, Piers identifies as a Catholic, so he's not going to do that. I may have said this earlier, but Russell seems to accept that he may well be going to jail. I don't know what will happen. I have to say that Dispatches documentary, they had actors for the alleged victims. If there are victims, of course, they've got my sympathy, no doubt. If I had to guess, not that it means anything, but I think he's probably done lots of borderline things, borderline criminal, and he may have gone over the edge a couple of times. If he does that, he may go to jail for a couple of years. If they really want to make an example of him, either because he's a truther or just because they can, he may go inside for 10 years. Who knows? And then Russell says something quite interesting. It's almost as if his higher self is talking to his run-of-the-mill human self. Hopefully this isn't a grift. And I don't know if he means hopefully for his fans he can prove that it isn't a grift or something like that. I'm very invested in the concept of the higher self. As I've told you before, I talk to my higher self, sometimes even out loud, which I know sounds a bit weird, but I talk to the me, the highest version of me, without all the stress and pressure of life. And it's quite amazing what results it yields. So I think Russell is aware that he has a higher self like everyone else. He has an angel, he has a demon. And this is just speculation. I think he's coming to terms with the fact that he did some pretty bad things. Now, whether they went over the line into criminality, he's denying it, although things he said almost intimates that he's going to get his comeuppance. Anyway, that's to come. I think it's in October the trial's going to start. So even as of now, I'm recording this in mid-May. That's still a while off. maybe Russell, does Russell know what his motivations are? We should all question our motivations. This thing, we're all brought up, I think, to believe that things are clearer in ourselves and that, the world's crazy, but my personality has been formed by a certain age. But we should all examine our motivations. I think maybe one difference, I think Russell probably questions his motivations slightly more than Piers does. Russell again makes a point that has a grain of truth. He says his faith means that everything else is bullshit. Yes, but if you have actually done horrible things to women that have affected their lives, he will be tried, as we said. Yes, okay, if you believe in any kind of higher power, whether you actually identify as a Christian or another religion or just as a kind of a spiritual person, yeah, it's all bullshit, but if you've done bad things that have affected people, that's real. Piers really, I've got in my notes here, shows his hand again, saying, I respect your faith, but then challenges him because he used to be an atheist. And there's a very funny bit. Russell does a great impression of Piers. It's not, he doesn't go for a really accurate voice, but it's that whole, the gotcha probing. You used to be an atheist, then you're a Buddhist, now you're a Christian. What does that mean? It's that kind of thing. And he actually comes out of a bit of anger and he probes Piers to try and be a good man. You've got these gifts. He basically sums up Piers Morgan perfectly. Piers Morgan said, yes, so these are facts. And Russell says, no, they're not facts. They're information being tailored by you to get an effect. And in Russell's irritation, he does an impression of Piers changing positions on Israel. Right to defend themselves. It's a genocide. Get vaccinated. Don't get vaccinated. And, he's urging Piers to rise above the tabloid instincts and realise what his show could be. Does any of that mean anything to Piers? Russell then says, maybe we're both grifters, but faith in the Lord is much more important. And once again, when Russell Brand mentions generating profit, Piers comes in, is your book going to generate profit? That's not a very good Piers Morgan. I'm not trying to be accurate. Just the way he says it, it's just so obvious. Looking for zingers, looking for gotchas. And they do actually argue about Piers being neutral. Piers says, I'm one of the least neutral people you'll ever meet. And go back again, Chomsky talked about, I don't know if you mentioned the Overton window phrase. If you've never heard that phrase, by the way, have a look at it. It's basically the limits of acceptable debate. Chomsky says, yes, the mainstream media, they encourage argument within very recognised parameters, limits. They have a bit more back and forth. Russell, again, is probing Piers about being uncensored, guessing that the dead air part would be either cut out or commercialised. And I'd say it's been commercialised because it's been clipped by Russell. It's been clipped by Piers. And Piers did end up doing what Russell said he was going to do. They essentially kind of psychoanalyse each other, and they're both quite accurate. Piers says, I'm not trying to trap you, which is probably not a good move when you then follow up with something that, I'm not trying to trap you. I only know you're an atheist because you told me. And I would say, yeah, years ago he was an atheist, then he was a Buddhist, but you're just choosing to bring it up now. He didn't tell him just before the interview and said, can you please bring this up, that my views are changing. So Piers has got another media trick up his sleeve, which is that when you've been a public figure for, 20 years, however long Brand's been around, there's loads of stuff they've said, and you can trawl through interviews they've given on TV or in print or on the radio, and you can always find things. It's whether you want to trap the person. Russell quite diplomatically says, I don't think you're trying to trap me, but you remain an avatar of something mercurial and untrustworthy in the media space, pointing out that the aforementioned Rupert Murdoch won't allow people space to say anything against powerful interests. Piers then points out Murdoch's Fox News have been happy to have Russell on. Is it hypocrisy that Russell goes on Fox News? Well, go back to John Lennon. The bedding in 1969 was an amazing thing where he was talking to the establishment media about the establishment in a negative light, that they encourage wars and so forth. I don't really think it's that hypocritical to go on something that's got a big audience and try and make your points, even if they're against, I don't know if he's gone on Fox News and slagged off Fox News itself, but he went on MSNBC and sort of talked about the limitations of mainstream media and making it clear that he's including MSNBC. So he has done that. Russell asks Piers what he thinks is pure and beautiful and what his role is. And Piers says his role is to lead debates, to try and find the truth and to challenge authority. He mentions that he's criticised Trump, and I'm like, really? Does Trump give a fuck what Piers Morgan says? Donald Trump's a law unto himself. He doesn't care what people who've got real power think. So I think Piers' show, which is entertaining but is a cartoon show, I don't think it's going to affect Donald Trump's life too much. Piers actually kind of let slip something. He says something quite telling, which is that few in media are intellectually honest enough to say that the Iran situation is unclear. So he's dropped in a bit of a thing there. That, okay, most media are not intellectually honest. There you go. Perhaps without saying that, he's kind of trying to distance himself again from the mainstream media. And this is funny. He defends his Israel switch. I've already mentioned this, I think, as evolution. Brings out the right to defend themselves line again. But, of course, he didn't apply the same thing to Russell Brand's evolution. Russell kind of lets it go this time, actually. He goes for another zinger about whether October the 7th was an act of terrorism. But Russell just talks again about faith. This time he kind of ignores it. So they're kind of ignoring each other as well as exposing each other at the same time. It's very fascinating. And again, just one more time, this is the crux. Russell does avoid questions, but Piers is looking for simplistic answers and outcomes. I talked earlier, he was trying to get Abby Martin to condemn Hamas. He said to Professor Morandi, if you've never heard that name, have a look at their talks. If you watch one of their talks, it'll be interesting, then you'll get tired of it. Whether Professor Morandi has got anything negative to say about the Iran regime. Have you got anything negative to say, Professor Morandi? Anyway, Russell Brand ends with "Thou shalt not kill." Piers holds up his book as a traditional end to an interview. They shake hands and that's the end of it. Piers has done, I think he clipped some of the show and he's done a couple of follow-up interviews. Doesn't really feel that he's been exposed by Brand at all. There's a little advert at the end of his videos that, I'm the boss. This is uncensored. No one tells us what to say. And that being said, I'm going to leave you with that. Are they grifters? How much of it's calculated? You make up your own minds. If you want to leave comments, that would be great. lifeandlifeonlypod@gmail.com, or leave a comment on the website or on the YouTube channel. However, this episode is not finished. I've got a few other bits to talk about. Just recently read Gabor Mate's recent book called The Myth of Normal, Illness, Health and Healing in a Toxic Culture. It's essentially, I would say, a book about trauma and healing. Now, he's written a number of books. I'm sure some of you have heard of Gabor Mate. He's done loads of amazing talks and interviews and so forth. I'd never read any of his books before then, but I thought, I heard him do an interview for this one. I saw that it was about 500 pages. I thought this will be like a culmination of everything that he has said before. And it kind of was, I think, because it looked into addiction and stress. Those are two of his big things. He uses trauma in the book sometimes to mean stress. I'm not going to give you any real spoilers. I mean, this book is 500 pages of small type, and it nearly killed me by the end of it because I'd spent a month with it and I kind of wanted to finish it, so I slightly rushed it a bit, and then I went back. This is what I often do with books. I read them all the way through, and then I spend a few more days dipping back into them, knowing that I've read the book. There are a few revelations, maybe they're not revelations, but they were to me, such as that babies can be affected by their mother's stress while they're in the womb. If the mother is highly stressed, it will affect the baby, and it's such a horrible thought to think that some babies grow up to be children and then adults have got almost no chance. I don't want to say that they've got no chance at all, but obviously environment is so key, and Gabor Mate really makes a case that genetics barely matter at all. It's virtually all environment. And yeah, the point's been made. Hitler wasn't an evil baby. Bringing it to the Beatles, Mark David Chapman wasn't evil as a baby. So it must be something to do with the environment, clearly. But Gabor Mate says it's maybe, I don't know if he says 100%, but mostly all environment. Now, just as a bit of a sidebar, I think I've talked about this before on Glass Onion, but I once went on a John Lennon forum and I said, they were talking about the killer and most of them didn't want to mention his name. And I said, well, he wasn't born evil, presumably, and no one in his family did anything particularly criminal. So it must be a product. He must be a product of our society, and we need to deal with that. And someone wrote back, oh, so John Lennon deserved to die, which tells you something about forums when they're challenged. In this book, Gabor Mate actually links personality traits to specific diseases, which I hadn't heard before. I'm not going to give a lot of it away, but just to say that people who, for example, can't say no to anyone, or people who repress all their anger, they may be prone to specific diseases. He's quite hard on medical doctors at times. And, you know, I generally give the example that about 15 years ago, I went to my GP about some ailments I was having. And I said, you know, when I'm relaxed, they seem to go away. And then when I'm stressed, they seem to reappear. And this doctor, who was admittedly a little bit smug anyway, didn't really like his manner. He just sort of looked through me as if I hadn't said anything. Now doctors are pretty receptive to the idea that stress can cause illness. So why did we have to wait that long? Not being hard on doctors. My sister, who used to be a nurse, she talked quite eloquently about how tough it is in the NHS for doctors. Overall, I'd say this is quite mind-blowing information. But at the same time, Gabor has actually said jokingly that he's made a career out of stating the obvious. And when you read this stuff, a lot of it is things that you may not have come across in books or even thought about. But then when you read it, you think, yeah, that's kind of obvious, isn't it? So there's a lot of that. But certainly there's a lot here, particularly if you haven't read too many books about trauma and healing and you don't know that much about it. You know, I think a lot of it will really blow your mind. So basically a book recommendation there. My only criticism, I think he shows, for example, he shows total faith in the COVID vaccine. And I think the general narrative of that. I should say, though, that I think he was writing this book around that time. So if he revises it in the future, he might change a few things. And he seems to buy into, at that time it was Clinton versus Trump, the kind of Clinton good, Trump bad comparison. Mainstream liberal, I'd probably call him, based on this. But having said that, he does point out that people who get into power are often damaged, and maybe it's because they're damaged. I think Russell Brand would agree with that. And in fact, Gabor Mate has been on Russell Brand's podcast, Under the Skin, I think more than once. I'll put that in the show notes as well. Anyway, that's that. Just a couple of other very brief things here. I've talked about on the show before that I kind of have what I call a wobble. I have a sink into a bit of a trough about 3 times a year for about a week. And it's normally triggered by something, but it almost feels like it's something that is persistent, that this keeps happening. What's quite interesting about it, I encourage people generally to, if it's not a serious problem that you're facing, try and laugh at yourself. Try and laugh at the problem. And I have to laugh at the fact that I keep a diary and I kind of know when a storm is coming. And I know that when I'm in the midst of it, my thoughts might not be completely rational. That I might start to believe negative things about myself or other people or the world that aren't true. And that when I get back to what is my general default state, which is fairly okay with things and myself, I think, yeah, that was pretty irrational. And I can kind of read my diary back and say, and know in real time that I knew that this wasn't rational. But then when it happens again, I would call it take it more seriously than I should, rather than just a wobble that you have to coast through for a few days. Now, I'm not talking about people who have proper serious bipolar. I'm just talking about episodes. And I do have extremes of mood and energy, which are more than most people I know. But what I really want to say is that if you do know somebody who seems to plunge into these depressions, which hopefully will be brief, please try to understand they're not doing it on purpose. That if you are in the grip of something like this and you're not thinking rationally, you can intellectually know that what you're feeling is not rational, but that doesn't mean you can stop it. It's a very strange thing. I just wanted to leave that with you. We've obviously talked about depression, for example. I did a podcast called An Uplifting Conversation About Depression that I'm quite proud of. That's in the archives. Finally, something very inspirational. This actually happened around the same time as the Morgan and Brand talk. So again, I'm a couple of weeks behind. The London Marathon, it was April the 26th, a Sunday. The London Marathon is something I remember from being a child. I don't really follow sport as much as I used to anyway. I happened to be working that day, and there's a TV room at work, and I was quite early for work, and I watched about 10 minutes of it. Didn't really think much about it. But just to give you a bit of history, you probably know the origin of where the actual word marathon comes from. The story of the messenger travelling from Marathon. But if you take 1896 as the first official marathon in the modern Olympics, we waited 130 years for someone to break 2 hours. Apart from, some of you will know that Kipchoge broke it with it was an assisted, non-competitive, with pacemakers and so forth. And he broke 2 hours, 1:59:40. But competitively, we waited 130 years for someone to break it, which was Sebastian Sawe of Kenya. But do you know how long it took for another person to break it? 11 seconds. Sebastian Sawe of Kenya came in at 1:59:30. Behind him, 1:59. It was 40 on the screen. I think it got corrected to 41. Yomif Kajauchka of Ethiopia, who was actually on his marathon debut. Now, Sawe got all the credit for coming first, obviously. Kajauchka did get one interview that I saw, and he speaks English in a quite entertaining way. It's a sort of broken English, a bit like Sifan Hassan, if you know her. But Sawe did make all the running, and I think Kajauchka would probably admit that he ran his time partly because of Sawe. Sawe was the one pushing it. Now, there have been some great videos since breaking down the pace that these guys are running at. They obviously focus on Sawe because he won, but if you think of the difference being 11 seconds, then all the splits for how long they were covering a mile, kilometre, etc., they're all more or less the same when you talk about 11 seconds difference. I'll put a couple in the show notes again, but one video broke down their pace in terms of, like I say, a mile, 400 metres, 200 metres. Turns out they were doing 400 metres in 68 seconds. And 68 seconds, I don't know how many club runners could run 400 metres in 68 seconds. Maybe quite a few. But you're looking at them doing that 4 times 26, 104 times. So you'll probably get a good club runner who can do 68, not be too tired. Then you'll get a mile, someone who specialises in the mile, for example, or maybe a 5K park run. And they might be able to get something close to, 3 minutes, under 3 minutes for a kilometre, or it's something like 4:35 around there for the mile. I mean, 4:35 is a phenomenal mile time, just for 1 mile. There's another video, there have been a few of these. When Kipchoge did this, like I said, this assisted sub-2 hour marathon, soon after that, there was a video of people on, it's not a treadmill, it's almost like a travelator, is that what they call it? It's like a huge treadmill, and they were getting members of the public. They'd set it to the pace of Kipchoge, which is basically the same as the pace for Sawe and Kajauchka. And they were trying to see how the average member of the public, how long they could keep going on this travelator thing. And it's seconds for most people. And then you get a few club runners there running, I don't know, maybe they managed a minute even. But there's one guy on a recent video who tries to do Sawe's pace on a treadmill, and it's 21 kilometres an hour, which most treadmills don't go up to, but he seemed to find one that did, and he managed 2 kilometres at that speed. And he said, and the guy looked, he was a young guy, looked pretty fit, and also quite thin as well, because there were obviously someone with a totally different body shape carrying a lot of fat would not be able to do what Sawe did anyway. But this guy looked, like I said, young, quite slim. He managed 2 kilometres, and he said, I was quite happy with 2. I wouldn't be able to do 3. And then he says, it is insanity for someone to do 42 kilometres. You know, when you see club runners just collapsing after 2 kilometres at that pace, or even 5 kilometres, that would be a hell of a good park run. You know, you see them like almost unable to breathe, you know, just breathing heavily and just completely collapsed. And you think that someone has done what they've just tried to do an extra 10 times or something. There's a channel that I'd recommend. I'll put it in the show notes. Mark Lewis. He's broken down the numbers of Mo Farah's pace and Keely Hodgkinson. That's our 800-metre runner. And there's a couple of entertaining videos where he takes on Britain's fastest 9-year-old and gets just absolutely creamed. And then he also tries to run at the pace of the world's fastest walker. This is all good stuff. But just to say that if you want to have a look at that marathon, I think actually it's on YouTube. It's not the BBC coverage. It's another outlet. And I watched about the last 40 minutes, and it's just amazing. And if you look at the stats, if you're into stats, you'll love all this breakdown of this pace. I mean, essentially they're running 17 seconds for every 100 metres. A good 100-metre runner would do that pretty easily. I think Antony Joshua, the boxer, did something like 11.5 seconds. But just try and run 100 metres in 17 seconds and then think that he's doing that, what's that, 16 times 26. I won't do the maths. You can do that, listeners. Doing it that many times. And with all that being said, it's nice to be back doing Life and Life Only. If you'd like to help out the show, there are links in the show notes to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. If you do perhaps consider my work as one thing, so I've got Glass Onion on John Lennon and Film Gold. Glass Onion, I'm not sure if there will be too many more episodes in the future, but the Film Gold podcast, I have been carrying that on. We just did Rocky 3 recently. But yeah, there will be podcasts coming out, and I'm still doing podcasts with Scott as a guest as well. No promises about the next episode, but when there's something I think is worth talking about, I will be here to talk about it. So I'll see you next time, and until then, take care of yourselves. All the best, and goodbye.